Egypt is heavily dependent on that American aid. It's one of the major sources of Egyptian income. It's about $2 billion a year in aid from the United States. And I wouldn't put it past President Trump to use that as leverage on Egypt. But Egypt's going to play the card that it often plays the card, is that if you cut out our aid, you could find a much more hostile government in Cairo. You could get the Muslim Brotherhood back, for example. So you don't really want to, you don't want to twist our arms too hard.
Since the ceasefire in Gaza started, there have been a lot of unanswered questions. How will Gaza be rebuilt? How can Hamas be prevented from taking control of Gaza again? And is it realistic to be talking about a two-state solution? The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been speaking to the Egyptian foreign minister, and Rubio asked for Egypt's close cooperation to help ensure that Hamas can never threaten Israel again. Well, Michael Oren is a historian, and he's worked in the Israeli government and was also Israeli ambassador to the United States from 2009 to 2013, and he joins me now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Laura. Hi.
Hi. So I'm keen to ask you a bit about Egypt's role in this, that of course we've heard about a bit in recent days. What kind of role do you foresee Egypt playing in the coming weeks?
Well, historically, Egypt has had a very ambivalent role in Gaza. From 1948 to 1967, Gaza was under Egyptian occupation. That ended with the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel became the occupier of Gaza. And since then, Egypt has had a connection with Gaza, but didn't really want it. During the peace negotiations between Egypt and Israel at the end of the 1970s, Egypt was offered by Israel to take Gaza back, and Egypt didn't want it. And so there is a border between Egypt and Gaza. It's known as the Philadelphia route, the famous Philadelphia route. There was a lot of smuggling under that route during the period when the Gaza Strip was under the control of Hamas, from starting in 2007. But Egypt certainly has an interest in keeping Gaza under wraps. Egypt has its own problems with Islamic radicals in Sinai. It's been fighting a war there against ISIS and other groups. ISIS has a connection with Hamas. And the one thing Egypt doesn't want is Palestinians going from Gaza into Sinai, into Egypt-controlled Sinai. And there have been several ideas floated, most recently by President Trump, to move Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula. And Egypt is adamantly opposed. We're going to see what happens now as President Trump continues now to talk with President al-Sisi of Egypt.
And there's been a suggestion that Trump could leverage aid in some form to try and see Egypt take an enhanced role. But obviously, when this idea, a similar idea, was mooted at the beginning of the conflict, Egypt did argue that it would threaten domestic stability and that it wasn't possible with public opinion as it was, or indeed with the military establishment, to actually get approval for something like what Trump is suggesting.
That's true, and Egypt is heavily dependent on that American aid. It's one of the major sources of Egyptian income. It's about $2 billion a year in aid from the United States. And I wouldn't put it past President Trump to use that as leverage on Egypt. But Egypt's going to play the card that it often plays the card, is that if you cut out our aid, you could find a much more hostile government in Cairo. You could get the Muslim Brotherhood back, for example. So you don't really want to, you don't twist our arms too hard, the Egyptians are going to say to the Americans. We'll see if some kind of midway can be found. President Trump has also made the same demand/request of Jordan, and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has suggested that 2 million Palestinians be relocated for a certain period to Indonesia until the reconstruction of Gaza is complete. So this is a very dynamic, fluid situation, and we're going to see the extent of the new Trump administration's ability to affect this type of change in the Middle East.
Jordan certainly seems to have been pretty obstinately opposed to that idea so far. Can I ask you about comments from Antony Blinken before Biden left office, that the US believes that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has actually lost? Do you think Hamas is still the most powerful organisation in the Gaza Strip?
Well, the two different questions. Israeli estimates that Hamas has recruited about 10,000 people. Israel killed about 20,000. So it hasn't replenished its ranks. But also, these are basically young people who can't undergo any military training. So it's not that Hamas is able to achieve the level of military prowess that it had before October 7th, 2023. But having said that, here's the second question. The second question is, yes, Hamas remains a very serious power in Gaza. Hamas is still the entity in Gaza holding the guns. And so there are people who want to say, well, we're going to move part of the Palestinian Authority from Ramallah into Gaza. Well, that'd be very good, but anybody you move from Ramallah who takes over authority in Gaza will be dead within 24 hours. Hamas Hamas will assassinate them. And the same may be true for international forces moving in. As long as Hamas is present, as long as Hamas has the weaponry, then in effect, any area that's not controlled by the Israeli Defense Forces is controlled by Hamas.
So what is it possible to do to prevent Hamas from taking control of Gaza?
Well, it has to be demilitarized. And the only way it can demilitarize it effectively is continue military pressure on it. It's very difficult because Hamas continues to hold hostages. And we've learned, in Israel, we've learned that the more you pressure Hamas militarily, they don't release hostages, they shoot the hostages. And which is why they're holding on to some of those hostages. And the question is whether they'll release all of them ever. I'm kind of doubtful. Maintain the military pressure and then cut off their route of supply. Cut off the route of supply through Egypt, cut off the route of supply principally from Iran, because Iran is the major backer of Hamas. And so many of those weapons that Hamas wields comes from Iran. And so it's going to require tremendous cooperation, not just between Israel and Egypt, but also Israel and the United States, Jordan, other allied countries in the Middle East, to cut off that oxygen to Hamas, and hopefully then it will wither.
And on that ceasefire deal that we've got in place now, you've been worried about the Palestinian prisoners who are being released under that deal. But I mean, the Israeli government didn't have to make that deal, did they?
Well, they kind of did. They kind of did. It's the nature of Israeli society that there's almost an unwritten pact between the people of Israel and the state of Israel that if Israelis are captured or taken hostage by hostile entities, the state of Israel will do everything in its power to release those hostages. If not, mothers will not send their kids to the army. And I'm telling you, my daughter has told me she won't send her kids to the army unless those hostages are released. And so they're willing to pay an immense price to get those hostages back, because the release of hostages is not just a moral situation for the state of Israel, it's a strategic consideration for the state of Israel. It goes to our ability to withstand future threats. Our national resilience will be deeply, deeply impaired if the hostages aren't returned. And so we make this Faustian deal, basically, where we release 50 terrorists for every one Israeli captive, certainly women captives. That's been the deal so far. And we know from experience that many of those terrorists will go back to performing terror. It was Yahya Sinwar, who was released in 2011, who went on to be the head of Hamas and the mastermind of October 7th. It's a price that Israeli society, in the main, not everybody, but in the main, is willing to pay.
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking us through that. That was Michael Oren, who's a historian, and he's worked in the Israeli government and was, of course, the Israeli ambassador to the US from 2009 to 2013.